The dust was a living thing, swirling like a malevolent spirit across the broken land. Eleanor pressed 5-year-old Lily closer, the child's small body a trembling anchor against her own fear. Behind them, the hooves of 3 riders beat a relentless rhythm against the parched earth, a sound that clawed at Eleanor's nerves. They had escaped the homestead fire 2 nights ago, the one deliberately set, leaving behind everything but the clothes on their backs and the lingering stench of smoke and malice. Now, the men who had done it were closing in, their cruel laughter occasionally carrying on the wind. Eleanor's breath hitched, lungs burning with dust and terror. There was nowhere left to run. A cluster of jagged rocks offered no true concealment, only a brief respite before they were found. She pulled Lily into a small, sandy hollow, whispering reassurances she didn't feel. The riders were closer now, their forms silhouetted against the lowering sun, large and menacing. Just as she braced for the inevitable, a shadow detached itself from the rocks high above. He moved with an unnerving stillness, his horse the color of dust and shadow. He wasn't part of the pursuing group. He was alone, a solitary figure etched against the stark landscape. He wore a worn duster, a hat pulled low, his face obscured. He didn't call out, didn't make a grand entrance. He simply was there, suddenly positioned between them and the approaching riders. Eleanor froze, a new wave of fear washing over her. Who was this? Was he worse? The riders below saw him. Their laughter died, replaced by shouts. One of them pulled a rifle. The man on the ridge didn't move, not visibly. But then, with startling speed, his hand went to his side. Not a rifle, but a handgun. There was a single, sharp crack that echoed in the silence. One of the horses screamed, stumbling. The rider tumbled to the ground. The other 2 scattered, pulling their horses hard, yelling curses that didn't reach the ridge. They hesitated, clearly unnerved by this silent, accurate intervention from an unexpected quarter. The man up high didn't fire again. He simply watched them. After a tense moment, the 2 remaining riders turned their horses and rode back the way they came, abandoning their fallen companion. The silence that descended felt heavier than the sound had been. Eleanor remained huddled with Lily, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched the solitary figure descend the rocky slope, his horse picking its way carefully. He stopped a distance away, dismounted, his movements economical and quiet. He didn't approach them directly. He walked over to the fallen rider, checked him briefly, then moved to the injured horse, and with a swift, grim efficiency, ended its suffering. Eleanor averted her eyes, clutching Lily tighter. When she looked back, he was walking towards them, leading his own horse. He stopped a few yards away. She couldn't make out his face clearly in the deepening twilight, but she felt the weight of his gaze. He didn't speak for a long moment. The wind whispered past them, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush. Lily whimpered softly, burying her face in Eleanor's dress. Finally, his voice came, low and gravelly, like stones shifting. "You ain't safe here." It wasn't a question, or even an offer of help. It was a statement of fact. Eleanor swallowed, finding her voice. Who are you?" He didn't answer directly. He just stood there, his posture unyielding. "Sun's going down. Get on the horse." His tone held no warmth, only a quiet command that brooked no argument. Eleanor hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of distrust and desperate need. Was this truly better? But the alternative was being found by the men he had just driven off. She looked from him to the empty horizon where the riders had disappeared, then back to the man. He was a stranger, possibly dangerous, but he had stopped the others. For now, that had to be enough. Slowly, still trembling, she rose, lifting Lily into her arms. The back of his horse was a hard, unfamiliar perch. He had helped them up, his hands calloused but surprisingly gentle as he settled Lily in front of Eleanor. He then swung himself up into the saddle in front of them. He offered no conversation, no explanation. He simply turned the horse and set off at a steady pace, away from the setting sun and the direction the attackers had gone. Eleanor held Lily tight, her body stiff with exhaustion and weariness. The man, Silas, as she heard him referred to later in a brief, gruff exchange with a distant ranch hand, rode with an economy of movement that spoke of long hours in the saddle. He seemed less like a man on a horse and more like part of the creature itself, attuned to its rhythm. He spoke little, only issuing necessary directions or observations. Hold on. Water's brackish. Owl Eleanor, despite her fear, found herself watching him. His back was straight, his gaze fixed forward, scanning the terrain constantly. There was a stillness about him, a quiet competence that was both unsettling and, she grudgingly admitted, reassuring. He didn't ask about their past, about the fire, about the men. He seemed to operate solely in the present, dealing with the immediate necessities. Shelter, water, avoiding trouble. They found a shallow cave overhang just as the stars began to prick the inky sky. He dismounted first, his movement sufficient. He didn't offer a hand, but waited patiently while Eleanor carefully slid off with Lily. He built a small, smokeless fire deep inside the overhang, shielding it with rocks. He produced jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag, meager rations, but more than they had. He ate slowly, deliberately, offering them a portion with a simple nod. He still hadn't truly looked at her, his eyes always scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Lily, initially shy, watched him with wide, curious eyes. She was a child, less burdened by adult suspicion, more open to simple acts of perceived kindness. When a coyote howled in the distance, making Lily flinch, Silas merely glanced towards the sound, then back at the fire. "Just a coyote," he murmured, the sound almost swallowed by the wind. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to her. Eleanor felt a tiny crack in the wall of her fear. He wasn't overtly kind, not in the way of flowery words or gentle smiles, but his actions spoke of a different language, one of quiet protection and shared resilience in the face of the wilderness and the dangers it held. He took the first watch, sitting silhouetted against the night sky, his rifle across his knees. Eleanor watched him for a long time before exhaustion finally claimed her. The next few days were a blur of riding, sparse meals, and shared silence under vast, indifferent skies. Silas seemed to know the land intimately, navigating by the sun and stars, finding water sources that Eleanor would never have noticed. He kept them moving, always aware of their surroundings, always watchful. He didn't push them relentlessly, adjusting his pace when Lily grew tired or Eleanor's face showed strain. He never complained. He just endured, and by his presence, he made enduring possible for them too. Lily began to lose some of her shyness. She would hum quietly on the horse, or point out a bird. Once, when they stopped by a small creek, she toddled towards the water's edge. Silas, who seemed to be watching everything at once, moved subtly, placing himself between her and the deeper current, without making a fuss. He knelt by the water to fill his canteen, and Lily, emboldened, offered him a smooth stone she'd found. He took it, turned it over in his calloused fingers, and placed it carefully on a rock nearby before standing. He didn't smile, but there was a flicker in his eyes that Eleanor couldn't quite read. It wasn't unkindness. Eleanor found herself studying him whenever he wasn't looking. The lines etched around his eyes spoke of exposure to sun and wind. His hands, rough and capable, could handle a rifle with deadly precision or carefully adjust a saddle blanket. He was a man of few words, his thoughts locked away behind a remote gaze, but his presence was a tangible thing, a quiet strength they leaned upon. Her initial fear had begun to recede, replaced by a cautious respect and a dawning sense of gratitude. He wasn't a knight in shining armor. He was a man shaped by the same harsh world they were trying to survive, yet he had chosen to shield them from its worst elements. They skirted settlements, Silas preferring the open country, perhaps wary of drawing attention, or perhaps simply preferring solitude. But their supplies were dwindling. They needed to reach somewhere, a town, a place where Eleanor could perhaps find work, where they could stop running. She realized, with a jolt, that she was no longer just surviving despite him, but surviving because of him. The thought was unsettling, this dependence on a stranger. Yet, looking at Lily's face, less drawn now than it had been days ago, she knew she couldn't have gotten this far alone. The unspoken question hung between them. What would happen when they reached civilization? Would he simply ride away? The thought was surprisingly unwelcome. After what felt like an eternity, a huddle of buildings appeared on the horizon, nestled in a shallow valley. A town. Silas reined in his horse a mile or so out, observing it through a small spyglass. Eleanor watched him, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. This was it, the end of their strange, silent journey together. He lowered the glass, his expression unreadable. "Fairfield," he said, his voice flat. "Looks quiet enough." For now, he still didn't look at her. "Supplies are low. We'll go in." He didn't say "you'll go in," or "I'll take you in." He said "we'll go in." It was a small word, but it landed in the vastness of their shared silence with surprising weight. It was the first time he had included himself in their immediate future. Eleanor felt a flicker of something warm in her chest, quickly suppressed. Dependence was dangerous, but so was being alone. The dusty main street of Fairfield was less a promise of safety and more a stage for wary observation. Heads turned as Silas rode in, Eleanor and Lily perched behind him. He wasn't flamboyant, didn't seek attention, but his quiet confidence and the presence of a woman and child clinging to his back made him an instant focal point. The general store, the saloon, the few houses, all seemed to hold watching eyes. Eleanor felt exposed, vulnerable, the subject of unspoken questions and judgment. Their clothes were dusty, travel-worn. Lily's face was smudged, her hair tangled. They looked like vagrants, like trouble. The atmosphere was heavy with suspicion, a different kind of threat than the open cruelty of the gang, but suffocating nonetheless. Silas dismounted in front of the general store. Again, he waited for them to get down, his movements still measured and quiet. He tethered his horse, then stood beside them, not touching, but a solid, undeniable presence at their side. The storekeeper, a stout man with narrow eyes, eyed them with thinly veiled disdain. "Something you need?" he asked, his voice cold. Silas met his gaze steadily. "Supplies," he said. "For us," again the word us. Eleanor stood straighter, a flicker of defiance kindled by the storekeeper's hostility. She was tired of being looked down upon, of being afraid. Lily, sensing the tension, pressed herself against Eleanor's leg. Silas bought flour, beans, coffee, jerky, and a few other necessities. He paid with coins, counting them out carefully. He didn't linger, didn't engage in small talk. As they left the store, Eleanor heard the low murmur of voices inside. Gossip, speculation. Silas seemed oblivious or simply unconcerned. They found a small, abandoned lean-to behind the livery stable, a place that offered minimal shelter but was out of the direct line of sight from the street. It wasn't much, but it was better than sleeping in the open. Silas built a small fire outside the lean-to. As dusk fell, the sounds of the town drifted towards them, laughter from the saloon, the distant bark of a dog. It felt both close and impossibly far away. Eleanor cooked a simple meal. They ate in silence, the quiet between them different now, less charged with uncertainty, more with a shared understanding born of the trail. But the tension of being in the town remained. The stares, the whispers, they were a constant reminder of their precarious position. Eleanor knew they couldn't stay long in the lean-to. She needed to find proper shelter, find a way to earn money. The sheer impossibility of it threatened to overwhelm her. But then she looked at Lily, sleeping curled up against her side, and she found a reserve of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She wouldn't break. She couldn't. Over the next few days, Eleanor ventured into the town, looking for work. The doors were mostly closed to her. A widow with a child, dirty and unknown, traveling with a silent stranger. She was a pariah. The women of the town averted their eyes or offered cold, brief answers. The men looked with suspicion or something worse. Silas remained their quiet anchor. He spent his days tending to his horse, sharpening knives, or simply sitting near the lean-to watching. He didn't interfere with Eleanor's search for work, but his presence was a deterrent to those who might have considered preying on her vulnerability. He bought a few more supplies when needed, always keeping them fed, always maintaining his silent vigil. Eleanor noticed the townspeople's fear of him. He was an unknown quantity, capable and remote, clearly not someone to be trifled with. They didn't approach him, didn't try to question him. He was as much an outsider as she was, perhaps more so. Then came the day the threat they had outrun caught up to them. Not the gang directly, but a man who rode into town, asking questions, his eyes scanning the faces in the street. Eleanor saw him from a distance and froze. He was one of the men who had chased them. He didn't see her immediately. She ducked back into the shadows, her heart pounding. He was talking to the storekeeper, gesturing. The storekeeper, that cold-eyed man, was nodding, pointing in the general direction of the livery. Eleanor knew instantly. They had been betrayed. The fear was back, cold and sharp, but beneath it, a hard knot of defiance had formed. Not again. She wouldn't run again. She found Silas by the lean-to, his back to her, cleaning his rifle. "They're here," she said, her voice low but steady. He stopped, turning slowly. For the first time, she saw his eyes clearly. They were the color of the gray sky before a storm, intense and focused. He didn't ask who. He didn't ask how she knew. He simply nodded. "Stay with Lily," he said. It wasn't a request. The man from the gang, joined by another rider who had arrived with him, walked towards the livery stable, their boots kicking up dust. They looked confident, casual, like hunters closing in on cornered prey. The few people on the street seemed to melt away, disappearing into doorways or around corners. No one wanted to witness what was about to happen, much less intervene. The town, so quick to judge and condemn, was equally quick to abandon. Eleanor held Lily close, hidden behind a stack of barrels, her eyes fixed on Silas. He stood away from the lean-to in the open, his rifle no longer in pieces but held loosely in his hands. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting. The two men reached the entrance to the alleyway leading to the lean-to. They saw him. Their casual air vanished. Hands went to holsters. "Well, looky here." One of them sneered. The woman stealer, his partner, chuckled. A harsh, unpleasant sound. Silas didn't respond with words. He raised the rifle smoothly, the movement economical and precise. "Get out," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. It wasn't loud, but it carried absolute authority. The sneer on the lead man's face hardened. "Or what, old man?" He started to draw his pistol. Silas fired. It wasn't a warning shot. The man stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, his pistol clattering to the ground. The other man, startled, fumbled with his own weapon. Silas shifted his aim fractionally and fired again. This shot hit the second man's hand. He cried out, dropping his gun. It was over in seconds. 2 shots, 2 men disabled, not killed but clearly out of the fight. Silas lowered his rifle. He didn't advance. He simply stood there, watching the 2 wounded men writhe in the dust. The sudden, decisive violence hung in the air, shocking in its swiftness and efficiency. Slowly, cautiously, the townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places. They stared, eyes wide, at the scene in the alley, the 2 wounded men, the silent figure of Silas standing over them, the rifle now held loosely by his side. They had expected a messy brawl, perhaps a drawn-out shootout. They had seen Silas as an unknown, possibly dangerous, but they hadn't anticipated this quiet, absolute competence, this willingness to protect outsiders with such brutal, measured force. Eleanor emerged from behind the barrels, holding Lily. She walked to Silas's side, standing shoulder to shoulder with him, her gaze fixed on the 2 men. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a fierce, protective resolve. She wasn't the cowering victim they had judged. She was a mother defending her child, standing alongside the man who had become their unexpected protector. The storekeeper was the first to find his voice, though it was hesitant, stripped of its usual arrogance. What happened?" he stammered. Silas finally looked away from the wounded men, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the townsfolk. They came for him, he said, inclining his head towards Eleanor and Lily. They ain't comin' back. It was a simple statement, a promise delivered with quiet finality. The townspeople exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't just about two outsiders anymore. This was about the kind of men who would pursue a woman and child, and the kind of man who would stand against them. And they had just witnessed that man's capability firsthand. A silence fell, different from the one before, less judgmental, more stunned. No one offered to help the wounded men. No one rushed forward to condemn Silas. The balance had shifted. The quiet man and the woman who had been so vulnerable were suddenly figures of consequence, backed by a demonstrated will to protect. The town didn't welcome them with open arms. Not immediately. But the open hostility, the blatant judgment, had faltered. In the days that followed, small things began to happen. Someone left a basket of vegetables near the lean-to. The storekeeper, still wary, addressed Eleanor with a fraction more respect when she came in for supplies. A woman offered Lily a piece of candy. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a tentative step away from condemnation. Silas remained, still quiet, still watchful. He didn't explain why he stayed, and Eleanor didn't ask. They had found a fragile kind of equilibrium in the harshness of the world, bound by shared danger and unspoken loyalty. Eleanor, no longer defined by her fear, found the strength to approach people, to ask about odd jobs, her voice steady, her gaze direct. She was no longer hiding. She was building. The resilience that had been a flicker in the darkness had become a steady flame. The townspeople of Fairfield had expected the man to leave, the woman and child to disappear or succumb. They had been stunned not by a grand gesture, but by the quiet unfolding of courage, competence, and a bond forged in desperation. They had seen that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes, it stood silent and unwavering in the face of cruelty, changing the very air around it. Eleanor and Lily, with the silent man by their side, had found not a haven, but a foothold, their dignity earned not through ease, but through the enduring power of standing tall when the world sought to grind you into the dust.